Hi, everyone. This is Ray, the singing Tallit, continuing the reading of The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah by Alfred Edersheim, Chapter 8 of Book 2, The Visit and the Homage of the Magi and the Flight into Egypt. With the presentation of the infant Savior in the temple and his acknowledgement not indeed by the leaders of Israel, but characteristically by the representatives of those earnest men and women who looked for his advent, the prologue of such it may be called to the third gospel closes. From whatever source its information was derived, perhaps, as it has been suggested, its earlier portion from the Virgin Mother, the later from Anna, or else both alike from her, who with loving reverence and wonderment treasured it all in her heart. Its marvelous details could not have been told with greater simplicity, nor yet with more exquisitely delicate grace. On the other hand, the prologue to the first gospel, while omitting these, records other incidents of the infancy of the Savior. The plan of these narratives, or the sources whence they may originally have been derived, may account for the omission in either case. At first sight, it may seem strange that the Cosmopolitan Gospel by St. Luke should have described what took place in the temple and the homage of the Jews, while the Gospel by St. Matthew, which was primarily intended for the Hebrews, records only the homage of the Gentiles and the circumstances which led to the flight into Egypt. But of such seeming contrast there are not a few in gospel history discords, which soon resolve themselves into a glorious harmony. The story of the homage to the infant Savior by the Magi is told by St. Matthew in language of which the brevity constitutes the chief difficulty. I'd like to reiterate, this book was written in the late 1800s, so some of the language, and it may sound very Anglican. Even their designation is not free from ambiguity. The term Magi is used in the Septuagint by Philo, by Josephus, and by other profane writers alike in an evil and, so to speak, in a good sense. In the former case, as implying the practice of the magical arts; in the latter, as referring to those Eastern, especially the Chaldeans, priests, sages, whose researches, in the great measure of yet mysterious and unknown to us, seem to have embraced much deep knowledge, though not untinged with superstition. It is to these latter that the Magi spoken of by St. Matthew must have belonged. Their number, to which, however, no importance attaches, cannot be ascertained. Various suggestions have been made as to the country of the East whence they came. At the period in question, the sacerdotal caste of the Medes and of the Persians was dispersed over various parts of the East, and the presence in those lands of a large Jewish diaspora, through which they might and probably would gain knowledge of the great hope of Israel, is sufficiently attested by Jewish history. The oldest opinion traces the Magi through partially and insufficient ground to Arabia, and there is in this of a favor to it that not only the closest intercourse existed between Palestine and Arabia, but that from 120 BC to the 6th century of our era, the kings of Yemen that who professed the Jewish faith. For if, on the other hand, it seems unlikely the Eastern Magi would spontaneously connect a celestial phenomenon with the birth of the Jewish king, evidence will, on the other hand, be presented to connect the meaning attached to the appearance of, quote, the star at the particular time with Jewish expectancy of the Messiah, but we are anticipating. So it's very likely that these men were astrologers or astronomers of the time, and it hints at them being of the Chaldean. Some people say that these are the guys of the school that Daniel would have started when it was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, or in the court of Darius the Mede later, that this could be the school that they started. You know, these guys could have all been eunuchs. They could have all been of a caste of magician priests whose whole understanding of heaven was literally based on the observance of what happens in the heavens. So when they saw the certain star appear that had not been there before, certain stellar alignments, they would have been cued that something important was happening. Shortly after the presentation of the infant Savior at the temple, certain magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem with strange tidings. They had seen it rising, quote unquote, a sidereal appearance, which they regarded as betokening the birth of the Messiah, King of the Jews, in the sense which at the time attached to that designation. Accordingly, they had come to Jerusalem to pay homage to him, probably not because they imagined he must be born in the Jewish capital, but because they would naturally expect there to be to obtain authentic information where he might be found. In their simplicity of heart, the Magi addressed themselves in the first place to the official head of the nation. The rumor of such an inquiry, and by such persons, would rapidly spread throughout the land, or throughout the city. But it produced on King Herod and his capital a far different impression from the feeling of the Magi. Unscrupulous and cruel as Herod had always proved, even the slightest suspicion of danger to his rule, the bare possibility of the advent of one who had such claims upon the allegiance of Israel, and who, if acknowledged, would evoke the most intense movement on their part, must have struck terror into his heart. Not that he could believe the tidings, though a dread of their possibility might creep over a nature as Herod's, but the bare thought of a pretender with such claims would fill him with suspicion, apprehension, and impotent rage. Nor is it difficult to understand that the whole city should, although on different grounds, have shared the troubles of their king. You got to remember that King Herod had married a Hasmonean princess. He had married the woman who wanted the head of John the Baptist, was a Hasmonean princess. Herod married into that family. His family had been servants in the court of the Hasmoneans, but he was named the King of the Jews by Augustus Caesar because he was the friend of Caesar there, and he became the quote-unquote King of the Jews, though many Jews will point out he was an Idumean, which they did not like. So he was a descendant of Edom in their eyes. He was certainly not, as some have suggested, though he called himself a Jew, by the way. It is certainly not, as some have suggested, from the apprehension of the woes which, according to the popular notion, were to accompany the advent of the Messiah. I'd like to point out also that this man died in a horrible way. He was eaten by worms from his insides. He had a severe infection in his groinal region, where he had a worms actually invading into his body there. He died terribly. Throughout the history of Christ, the absence of such woes was never made a ground of objection to his messianic claims, and this because these woes were not associated with the first advent of the Messiah, but with his final manifestation in power. And between these two periods, a more or less long interval was supposed to intervene, during which the Messiah would be, quote, hidden, either in the literal sense or perhaps as it was in his power, or else in both respects. This enables us to understand the question of the disciples as to the sign of his coming and of the end of the world, and the answer of the Master. But the people of Jerusalem had far other reasons to fear. They knew only too well the character of Herod, what the consequences would be to them or to anyone who might be suspected, however unjustly, of sympathy with any claimant to the royal throne of David. Because you must remember that Herod, as the friend of Caesar, as the appointed king, appointed by the Roman government, anyone who challenged his throne was not only an annoyance, because you have to remember he had 3 sons, and his 3 sons split the kingdom up 3 ways. Actually, the Roman government made sure they split it up into tetrarchs. That's why you remember in the New Testament it mentions Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, because one of the 3 sons of Herod is the one who was there as a tetrarch, or a ruler of a third. He ruled all of what was thought of as Israel or Palestine. So anyone who came to challenge his right, he had to get rid of them, because worst of all, people might rally behind whoever this person was who said that they were the rightful king. And if people rallied behind him and the Jews started another revolt, Herod would be dethroned most likely by Rome if he couldn't put that revolt down. And the Jews were known for rebellion. They were known for fighting back against the rulers that had been established over them, particularly those from outside the city, which is why we read that most likely the census that was called in Israel was actually not so much done by Augustus Caesar as it implies in the New Testament, but probably more likely handled by Herod on behalf of Augustus, done in the Jewish manner, which is to go to the city of your birth and then register by your tribe and your clan and your father. You list yourself as a son of your father, a member of the clan you're a part of, and then a member of the tribe of which you're a part of, and that allows you to not have to do things the way the Gentiles do them, which hopefully would keep people from getting too stirred up, because anytime Israel has a census, people get scared because there's probably going to be a problem. All right, let's see. Shortly after, all right, let's see. Where are we at? Herod took immediate measures characteristics by his unusual cunning, or his usual cunning, sorry. He called together all the high priests, both past and present, and all the learned rabbis, and without committing himself as to whether the Messiah was already born or only expected, simply propounded to them the question of his birthplace. This would show him where the Jewish expectancy might be looked for of the appearance of his rival, and thus enable him to watch alike that place and the people generally. While it might possibly bring to light the feelings of the leaders of Israel, at the same time he took care diligently to inquire the precise time when the sidereal appearance had first attracted the attention of the Magi. He keeps using the word sidereal because it has to do with the position of the stars in the heavens. There's such a thing as called sidereal time, which has to do with the movement of the stars in the sky over the course of time. Let's see. This would show him where the expectancy was. This would enable him to judge how far back he would have to make his own inquiries, since the birth of the pretender might be made to synchronize with the earliest appearance of the sidereal phenomenon. So long as anyone lived who was born in Bethlehem between the earliest appearance of that star and the time of the arrival of the Magi, that child was not safe. The subsequent conduct of Herod shows that the Magi must have told him that the earliest observation of the sidereal phenomenon had taken place 2 years before their arrival in Jerusalem. This assembled authorities of Israel could only return one answer to the question, the subject which Herod had asked. As shown by the rendering of the Targum of Jonathan, the prediction in Micah 5:2 was at the time universally understood as pointing to Bethlehem as the birthplace of the Messiah. That such was the general expectation as it appears from Talmud, and it gives the Talmud verse here, where an imaginary conversation between an Arab and a Jew in Bethlehem is authoritatively named, where Bethlehem is authoritatively named as the Messiah's birthplace. Since Matthew reduces the prophetic utterance of Micah exactly as such quotations were popularly made at the time, it will be remembered that Hebrew, being a dead language so far as the people were concerned, that's not true. The Holy Scriptures were always translated into the popular dialect. The person so doing was designated the Methergomum, or the Dragomum, the Dragoman, or an interpreter. Now, he's referring back to, we learned before about the Targums, or the translations of the holy text into an easier to read text for the common people. Because if the common people were speaking, Aramaic, even though I've got a great book here that does a wonderful job using archaeology. This is Understanding the Difficult Words of Jesus. It does a great job using archaeology to prove that very likely the people were using Hebrew as a living language, just like they do today. That the Jews used many borrowed words that did come from Aramaic, but that on the whole, they were all speaking Hebrew, and it was a living language, which means it had, contractions and little coined phrases and all that kind of stuff popping in and out of it during that time, archaeologically speaking. But however, it may have benefited people to have it translated into words that made more sense to them. For instance, using Aramaic borrowed words, like, if you had to write, the Septuagint had been written, which was a Greek version of the Hebrew Holy Scriptures, given as a gift to the Ptolemies, who had, been friends to the Jews. Let's see. The assembled authorities told him one thing. which they must be in Bethlehem. These renderings, which at the time of St. Matthew were not yet allowed to be written down, formed the precedent for that, if not the basis of, our later Targum. In short, at that time, each one targumed for himself, and these Targumim, as our existing one of the prophet shows, were neither literal versions nor yet paraphrases, but something between them, a sort of interpolated translation. So he's saying that these works called Targums, which you weren't supposed to have, Pharisees, rabbis weren't even supposed to have, but a lot of them did. They were the kind of things that people would circulate around, and ways for common people to be able to remember and keep up with stuff. And it wasn't considered an official text by any means, nor yet paraphrases, but something between them, a sort of interpreting translation, that when targuming, the New Testament writers should be, in preference, make use of such a well-known and widely spread version as the translation of the Septuagint needs no explanation. So he's saying it's no surprise that they would quote stuff that sounds like it came out of the Septuagint as opposed to Hebrew text, because it was it was a lot cheaper to get a copy of the Septuagint than it was to try to get a Torah scroll. Torah scroll got to be done a particular way, got to use a certain ink, got to be done only on fleece or vellum. The skin of sheep have to be butchered. Ink has to be manufactured in the appropriate way. It has to be done by hand. It cannot be a single mistake, etc., etc. While you get a cheap copy of the Septuagint, for much less money. That they did not confine themselves to it, but when it seemed necessary, literally or targumaically rendered a verse appears from the actual quotation of the New Testament. Such targuming of the Old Testament was entirely in accordance with the then universal method of setting a holy scripture before a popular audience. It is needless to remark that the New Testament writers would targum as Christians. These remarks apply not only in the case under immediate consideration, but generally to the quotations from the Old Testament and from the New. The further conduct of Herod was in keeping with his plans. He sent for the Magi, for the various reasons, secretly. After ascertaining a precise time when they had first observed the star, he directed them to Bethlehem, with the request to inform him when they had found the child, in pretense that he was equally desirous with them to pay him homage. As they left Jerusalem for the goal of their pilgrimage, to their surprise and joy, the star had attracted their attention at its rising, and which, as seems implied in the narrative, they had not seen of late, once more appeared on the horizon, and seemed to move before them, till it stood over where the young child was. That is, of course, over Bethlehem, not over any special house in it. Whether a turn of the road close to Bethlehem, they lost sight of it, or they no longer heeded its position, since it had seemed to go before them to the goal that had pointed out. For surely they needed not the star to guide them to Bethlehem. Or whether the celestial phenomenon now disappeared is neither stated in the gospel narrative, nor is indeed of any importance. Sufficient for them as for us. They had been authoritatively directed to Bethlehem as they had set out for it. The sidereal phenomenon had once more appeared, and it had seemed to go before them till it actually stood over Bethlehem. And since in ancient times such extraordinary guidance by a star was a matter of belief and expectancy, the Magi would, from standpoint, regard it as a fullness confirmation that they had been rightly directed to Bethlehem, and thus rejoiced with exceeding great joy. It could not be difficult to learn in Bethlehem where the infant around whose birth the marvels had gathered would be found. Okay, so you have to understand, in the ancient world, there weren't a lot of roads. It was Rome that started laying down all the roads. That's why they used to say all roads lead to Rome. Because if you're anywhere that there's a set of roads that you don't have to navigate by the stars when you're traveling, it's because you must be in the Roman territories, because the Romans make sure that their road system was well maintained and led back to where people needed to go, which is everything goes back to Rome eventually. So if you were traveling across country, you would have to do so by the stars. Um, when people first came to this country, the United States, and they were going out west, I mean, a lot of them were traveling by the stars and just by the direction of going west. They're like, we're going to go west. We don't know where. We're just going to keep going west. So if wherever the sun sets, that's where you head, right? Sun sets in the west. Well, sort of in the west. This book is a lot to read. It appears that the temporary shelter or the stable have been exchanged by the Holy Family for a more permanent abode or house. When it says stable, in the Greek, that word can mean a place of eating. You might say like an animal's trough. But I ask you, when at Sukkot, what are you supposed to do in your sukkah? You're supposed to eat all of your meals in the sukkah. And the Hebrew translation of Matthew literally says that he was born in a sukkah. It's not even a question there. They say it's not a manger. It doesn't say he's born in a manger or in a stable or these words from Greek that were, getting as close as possible to the way it would be said in Hebrew. But it literally says he was born in a sukkah, which is a temporary dwelling where you would eat all your meals. With the exquisite, let's see, have been exchanged. And there the Magi found the infant Savior with his mother. With exquisite tact and reverence, the narrative attempts not the faintest description of the scene. It is as if the sacred writer had fully entered into the spirit of St. Paul. Quote, yea, though we have known Christ after the flesh, yet now henceforth know we him no more. And thus it should ever be. It is the great fact of the manifestation of Christ, not its outward surroundings, however precious or touching, that might be in connection with any ordinary earthly being, to which our gaze must be directed. The external may, indeed, attract our sensuous nature, but they detract from the unmatched glory of the great supersensuous reality around the person of the God-man in the hour when the homage of the heathen world was first offered him. We need not and want not the drapery of outward circumstances. The scene is best realized not by description, but by silently joining in the silent homage and the silent offerings of the wise men of the East. So he's really taken to spiritualizing this, because he's basically saying we don't even need to speculate about what was to be seen there. We don't even need to guess. We simply need to remember how holy and sacred it was that this happened. Well, maybe they didn't give you a description so that you wouldn't spend too much time building, manger scenes that were completely historically accurate, and having everybody show up for Christmas to the completely historically accurate manger scene. Let's see. Because I'm speaking against manger scenes, if that wasn't clear. You're not even allowed to make an image of anything on the heaven and the earth, much less to go and focus your attention on it in a strange and odd way, which I'm not going to say that I know people's hearts, but I am going to say that people know their hearts, and people know what they think in their hearts, and God knows what they think in their hearts. And if you can do things that are questionable with complete certainty of your own holiness in it, then go for it. I can't. I have to go by what the word says in the black and white, because I don't know how to make good decisions. He does. Before proceeding further, we must ask ourselves two questions. What relationship does this narrative bear to Jewish expectancy? And is there any astronomical confirmation of this account, besides their intrinsic interest? The answer to the first question, that is to say, the Jewish expectancy, will determine whether any legendary basis could be assigned to this narrative, while on the second, it will depend whether the account can be truthfully charged with an accommodation on the part of God to the superstitions or the errors of astrology. For if the whole was extra natural and the sidereal appearance specially produced in order to meet the astrological views of the Magi, it would not be sufficient answer in difficulty that great catastrophes and unusual phenomena in nature have synchronized in a remarkable manner with great events in human history. Which is, I've got a friend, I guess I should say I have a brother, uh, a gentleman who I talk to on Facebook time, and he considers himself a Magi. Um, and I said to him, well, if all these events, okay, if you really can use that to identify when things are going to happen, then let's just take big events and sync them all up with what actually was happening at the time, and we should be able to establish a discernible pattern. Of course you can't. He goes so far as to say that, Neptune and Uranus and even Pluto should be considered in the calculations of these astronomical events. And I have to point out to him, no one in the ancient world had ever heard of Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, because you cannot see them with the naked eye. You can only see 7 heavenly bodies with the naked eye. That's the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the Moon. That's it. That's the 7 heavenly bodies that move differently than the other. And of course, they all follow the sun around the ecliptic. So, but he thinks you should add in Uranus and Neptune, and he even said Pluto. And I said, Pluto's not even a planet anymore. Why would you want to add in Pluto? And he doesn't really have a good answer for that. And I say, listen, man, the reason that Pluto's not a planet anymore is because there are celestial bodies in the solar system right now that are larger than Pluto. They're called planetoids that we've discovered that are larger than Pluto. Should we take all of those planetoids into account while making our astrological projections of what's happening? Do we need to take in all the countless bits of stellar matter that are floating around out there into the equation, or just the traditional planets that you grew up with in school, which, like I said, again, Pluto is not even considered a planet anymore, because there's stuff out there that's bigger than Pluto that we found. It's just farther out in the solar system. I say if you're gonna do astrology, if you're gonna do using the positions of the stars in the heavens to map what's going on, which is a fine thing. I don't have a problem with that. You can really only use the same ones that the ancients would have been able to use, which is the 7. The 7. Of course, some would say, oh, but the Sumerians have texts that show 9 or 10 planets. Well, I mean, so what about all those planetoids? It's neither here nor there. Point being, is this the same thing that Alfred Edersheim's pointing out is, well, if every event in human history is marked by an astrological event, I mean, we should just map all the astrological events. We'll know when everything's going to happen. On the other hand, if the sidereal appearance was not of a supernatural origin, it would equally have taken place whether or not there had been any magi directed to Bethlehem. The difficulty is not only entirely removed, but the narrative affords another instance alike of the condensation of God to the lower standpoint of the Magi and his wisdom and goodness in the combination of circumstances. So he's saying that literally this is a supernatural event. It's not like the stars lined up and created something. We see a lot of people nowadays are saying like, well, Jupiter lined up with Saturn and it was very bright and it led them to, and he's saying, no, that's crazy, because if that wouldn't have taken them to Bethlehem, if anything, it would have made it wouldn't have guided them anywhere. It would have just been an event in the heavens that they could have seen. But they would have known when the events were going to happen. If it was a regularly scheduled event, like a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, why would that have any big significance to them? He's saying that he's taking the opinion that it's a supernatural event. As regards the question of the Jewish expectancy, sufficient has been said in the preceding pages to show that Rabbinism looked for a very different kind and manner of the world's homage to the Messiah than that of a few magi, guided by a star to his infant home. Indeed, so far from the serving as a historical basis of the origin of such a legend, a more gross caricature of the Jewish messianic anticipation could scarcely be imagined. Similarly, futile would it have been to seek a background from this narrative in Balaam's prediction. That's from Numbers 24:17. Since it is incredible that anyone could have understood it as referring to a brief sidereal apparition to a few magi in order to bring them to look for the Messiah, nor can it be represented as intending to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah, Isaiah 60 and 6, that they should bring golden incense, that they shall show forth the praises of the Lord. For supporting this figurative narrative, the language to have been grossly literalized. What would become of the other part of this prophecy, which must, of course, have been treated in the same manner, not to speak of that the whole evidently refers not to the Messiah, last of all, in his infancy, but to Jerusalem in her latter-day glory. Thus we fail to perceive any historical basis for a legendary origin of St. Matthew's narrative, neither in the Old Testament or still less in the Jewish tradition, and we are warranted in asking, if the account be not true, what rational explanation can be given to its origin, since its invention would never have been occurred to any contemporary Jew. Yes. Now, apparently, from what this is saying, he's saying it was so literal. The prophecy of Isaiah 60 is so literally fulfilled here that the other half of the prophecy seems that there must be a fulfillment to it, and that's literal too, because it was so literal that people literally presented him with gifts. Even though some people of the time, rabbis and such, may have said, well, I mean, it's symbolic of this and this, and it actually really means this. But literally, guys showed up and gave him gifts. But this is not all. There seems indeed no logical connection between this astrological interpretation of the Magi as any supposed practice of astrology among the Jews. I would like to point out that the Jews definitely practiced astrology, and that they lived their life on, what is that phrase, chutzpah, which is, I think, it means luck, but it can also mean an understanding of astrology or what's going on in the heavens. You can watch Chabad rabbis today, and they'll tell you about, how to gain power from the month of Kislev, which is when Hanukkah takes place. How to gain strength from particular times astronomically, and they even point out, like, we would say December, the Greeks would say Sagittarius, the Jews would say Kislev. Kislev is basically just when Sagittarius is in the sky. Yet, strange to some, let me point out, 2,000 years ago, when Ptolemy set the system up that we think of today as modern astrology, the stars were in different positions than they actually factually are now. The stars have, because of the precession of the equinoxes, the stars do drift over thousands of years. They do change position in the background over thousands of years. They do move around. But at the time that the rabbis would have been, everything would have actually been pretty lined up, because that was when Ptolemy set up the system, which is not even, it's not really even Greek, because the oldest example of an actual astrological map of the heavens is in the Temple of Dendera, which was found in Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte when his troops also found the Rosetta Stone. They found a bunch of ancient Egyptian sites, and one of them at Dendera contained, if you looked up on the ceiling, and you can look it up online, you can just Google the Temple of Dendera, and you can see the all the same symbols. Scorpio, you see the scorpion, you see Taurus in the sky, you see the bull, you see the lion, you see all the same things that you get from Greek. It's not Ptolemy that set it up. He just got it right out of the Greeks. Or sorry, he got it right out of the Egyptians. You got to remember, Ptolemy was Pharaoh of Egypt, sorta. The last of the Ptolemy pharaohs was Cleopatra. She wasn't Egyptian, she was Greek. She was a Greek princess ruling from back when Alexander the Great and his 4 generals conquered Egypt. You got to know your history, or nothing's going to make any sense. All right, there you go. This is not all. There seems no logical connection to the Jews in the East. The charge is to say, the least grossly exaggerated, that the Jews and other Eastern impostors pretended to astrological knowledge, and that such investigations may have been secretly carried on by certain Jewish students. It is readily admitted. But the language of disapproval in which such pursuits are referred to, such as the knowledge of the law, is not found with astrologers, and that's from Devarim. No, that's he sometimes he quotes the Talmud or the Mishnah, and I don't know what these sections are in the Talmud and the Mishnah, but he's citing his quotations. So, and the emphatic statement that we who learned even one thing from a mage deserved death show what views were authoritatively held. So, in the canonized rabbinical writings, where the Mishnah became really the first canonized kind of thing by Judah the priest, or Judah the prince, sorry, canonized word of mouth rabbinical teachings, which are really just oral tradition, oral understandings of what these things in the Torah, the written Torah, mean. He actually kind of printed it out and created what's called the Mishnah, which we might think of as, oh, great, now we've got this solid document. But plenty of people in nearby regions did not like that he did that, and they argued that he got the wrong information and that he didn't do it correctly. But because he wrote it down, his school of thought perseveres to today. So modern Jewish rabbis and Pharisees are working off of Judah the Prince's Mishnah, which then is studied and analyzed and torn into bits and pieces in the Talmud, where it's really an analyzation of what the Mishnah actually means. Okay. Of course, the Jews, or many of them, like most ancients, believed in the influence of the planets upon the destiny of man. But it was a principle strongly expressed and frequently illustrated in the Talmud that such planetary influence did not extend to Israel, because Israel does not live by luck anymore. Israel lives by the Torah. It must be admitted that this was not always consistently carried out, and there were rabbis who computed a man's future from the constellations or from the mazel. That's what it is. They live by the mazel. Yeah, mazel. Not chutzpah. Mazel. That's the word. Which is luck. Mazel tov. Good luck, right? Either of the day or the hour under which he was born. It was supposed that some persons had a star of their own, and that the representative stars of all proselytes were said to have been present at Sinai. Accordingly, they also, like Israel, had lost the defilement of the serpent, which is sin. One rabbi even had it that success, wisdom, the duration of life, and posterity depended upon the constellation. Such views were carried out till they merged into a kind of fatalism, or else the idea of a natal affinity, by which persons born under the same constellations were thought to stand in sympathetic rapport. The further statement that conjunctions of planets affected the products of the earth. Okay, so nobody had a problem believing that the planets affected the growth of plants. The Jews didn't have a problem thinking that the planets had an effect on the Gentiles, but they would have said, but we stand outside of that because we have the Torah. You don't look in heaven. The phrase is that the Torah is not in heaven, so you don't need somebody to go up and get it down for you, right? It's been brought down here. You don't need to look up there. Now, I would say that what's up there is in the Torah. I mean, absolutely. But you don't need to look up there for it because you got it in writing now. And let's see. The further statement that conjunctions of planets affected the products of the earth is scarcely astrological, nor perhaps this, that an eclipse of the sun betokened evil to the nations, and an eclipse of a moon to Israel, because the former calculated time by the sun, while the latter calculated time by the moon. So he's reiterating something that any rabbi will tell you these days. If there's an eclipse, a solar eclipse, it's bad news for the nations. If there's a lunar eclipse, it's bad news for Israel. But there is one illustrative Jewish statement which, though not astrological, is of the greatest importance, although it seems to have been hitherto overlooked. Since the appearance of Munter's well-known tractate on the Star of the Magi, writers have even endeavored to show that the Jewish expectancy of a Messiah was connected with a particular sidereal conjunction, such as that which occurred 2 years before the birth of our Lord in around 7 BC. And this on the ground of a quotation from a well-known Jewish commentator, Abarbanel, or rather Abrabanel. In his commentary on Daniel with the rabbi, he laid it down that the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces betoken not only the most important events, but referred especially to Israel, for which he gives 5 mystic reasons. He further argues that, as the conjunction had taken place 3 years before the birth of Moses, which heralded the first deliverance of Israel, it would also precede the birth of the Messiah and the final deliverance of Israel. But the argument fails not only because Abarbanel's calculations are inconclusive and even erroneous, but because it is manifestly unfair to infer the state of Jewish belief at the time of Christ from a haphazard astrological conceit of a rabbi of the 15th century. There is, however, testimony which seems to us not only reliable, but embodies most ancient Jewish tradition. It is contained in one of the smaller midrashim, of which a collection has lately been published. That's a midrash. So the midrash means the repeatings, the repetitions, things that were repeated, rabbi to student, rabbi to student. On account of its importance, one quotation at least from it should be made in full. The so-called Messiah Haggadah, or Agadah Mashiach, opens as follows: a star shall come out of Jacob. There is a Boreta in the name of the rabbis, the heptad in which the son of David cometh. In the first year there will be sufficient nourishment. In the second year the arrows of famine are launched. In the second year the arrows of famine are launched. And in the third a great famine. In the fourth neither famine nor plenty. In the fifth great abundance. The star shall shine forth, and this star is the star of the Messiah, and it shall shine from the east for 15 days. And if it be prolonged, it will be for the good of Israel. In the sixth, sang voices and announcements. In the seventh, wars. And in the close of the seventh, the Messiah is to be expected. A similar statement occurs at the close of a collection of the 3 midrashim, respectively entitled The Book of Elijah, chapters about the Messiah and the mysteries of Rabbi Simon and son of Jochiai. You got to remember, there wasn't just the Torah. There wasn't just people sitting around wondering what the Torah said. There were lots of other extra biblical works, the Book of Enoch, the Psalter of Solomon, the prophecies of the Sibylline, or something like that. I think that's what it's called. I go back to one of the first videos I made of this, and he reads the whole list off of these works that were commonly known to pretty much every Jew. And each of them had a different interpretation of who the Messiah would be and how he would come. Like Enoch talks about him coming with 10,000s of his saints, which you hear reiterated, I believe, by Peter when he says, the Messiah will come with 10,000s of his saints. All right. Where we read that a star in the east was to appear 2 years before the birth of the Messiah, the statement is almost equally remarkable, whether it represents a tradition previous to the birth of Yeshua or originated after the event. But 2 years before the birth of the Christ, which was, as we have calculated, took place at around 749 ACU. I don't even know what ACU is, or 5 before the Christian era, which should be 5 BC, brings us to the year 747 AUC, or 7 before Christ, in which such a star should appear in the east. Did such a star then really appear in the east 7 years before the Christian era? Astronomically speaking, and without any reference to the controversy, there can be no doubt that the most remarkable conjunction of planets, that is, of Jupiter and of Saturn, in the constellation of Pisces, which occurs only once in 800 years, did take place no less than 3 times in the year 747, or 2 years before the birth of Christ, in May or October, in both May and October, and in December. So that's at Shavuot, which is in May, at Shavuot in October, which would put it at Sukkot, and December, which would have put it probably at Hanukkah or the Feast of Dedication. So with 3 times in 1 year, this astrological event occurred, which only occurs every 800 years. This conjunction is admitted by all astronomers. It was not only extraordinary, but presented the most brilliant spectacle in the night sky, such as could not but attract the attention of all who watched the sidereal heavens, but especially of those who busied themselves with astrology. In the year following, that is 748, another planet, Mars, joined this conjunction. The merit of the first discovering these facts, of which it is unnecessary here to present the literary history, belongs to the great Kepler. And he's referring, of course, to Johannes Kepler, who I actually know about because I went to college for astronomy and physics. And in the Tools of the Astronomer class, we learned how to use Kepler's, who postulated that planets travel in elliptical orbits and not perfect circles. The model set up by Ptolemy was that everything in the heaven must be on perfect circles. So you have perfect circles that the planets are orbiting around. They're all orbiting around the Earth, and they're all going in perfect circles, but we have strange occurrences in the sky, which is what's called retrograde motion, where a planet, as it's going across the sky, sometimes they seem to stop, and then they seem to go backwards, and then they start going forward again. And that's called a retrograde motion. And most planets go through this at some point in the sky. You got to understand, they got long orbital periods. Like Jupiter has got a 12.5-year orbital period. You'd have to watch it for 12.5 years to see it go from one place in the sky all the way back around to where it started. That's 12.5 years. For Saturn, it's 30 years to go all the way around the sky and come back. It took 30 years for that to take place. So with Mars, the orbital period of Mars is, I think, like 1.7 Earth years, something like that. So you'd see it go, and it'd take about 1.7 years to come all the way back around. So when they all line up, Mars is moving pretty quick across the sky. Saturn's super slow. Jupiter's twice as fast as Saturn, and here comes Mars racing in, and they all line up together, at that time. But celestial alignments happen all the time. It's not a strange thing, but certain ones only happen on certain years. So Kepler, who had a teacher named Tycho Brahe, took all of Tycho Brahe's recordings that he made of planetary motion using telescopes, and he mapped them all out and said, you know what? Perfect circles don't line up. I mean, you could use perfect circles with little it's called the circles and then epicycles, that the planets are not only going on this one big perfect circle, but they got little tiny perfect circles they're also orbiting around. And it makes almost precise measurements, but it's not as precise as using an elliptical orbit gives you. So the great Kepler, who accordingly placed the nativity of Christ in the year 478. This date, however, is not only well nigh impossible, but it has also been shown that such a conjunction would, for various reasons, not answer the requirements of the evangelical narrative, so far as the guidance to Bethlehem is concerned. But it does fully account for the attention of the Magi being aroused, and even if they had not possessed knowledge of the Jewish expectancy described above, for their making inquiry of all around, and of certainly among the Jews. Here we leave the domain of the certain and enter upon that which is probable. And you have to remember that the planets continue in a steady motion. The sun and the moon continue in a steady motion. But every once in a while, the comet will appear. Like Halley's Comet, I think, is every 72 years. It shows up in the sky, and it's going on its own weird orbit, swinging around the sun and coming back in and out. And every 72 years, we see it. Now, there's all kind of comets that just fly in and never make it past the sun. They fly in and they'll brighten up the sky, and you'll never see them again. because they got to the sun and the sun ate them right up and burned them up. They burned up heading towards the sun. They just finally melted on the way in because the radiation from the sun made them blow apart, essentially. So, there could have been that up here in the sky. We'd have no record of it because comets come by all the time that never make it back out. Kepler, who was led to the discovery by observing a similar conjunction in 1603, also noticed that when the three planets came into conjunction, a new, extraordinarily brilliant and peculiarly colored evanescent star was visible between Jupiter and Saturn, and he suggested that a similar star had appeared under the same circumstances in the conjunction of the preceding nativity. Now that's interesting, because that could be a byproduct of gravitational lensing. See, planets, because of their mass, they warp space-time, and they actually cause the space around them to bend, and you can actually have a star that's behind something appear to be beside it. And this was proved. See, I know this is all stuff that a lot of you, this is Einstein, and that's old. This is 100-year-old astronomy we're talking about, by the way. Einstein postulated that objects that were massive would warp space-time. So the only test that they could do to prove it was there was an eclipse, right? So people were witnessing an eclipse that happened at different points around the world. And guys measured like how close a particular star was to the sun. When the total eclipse happens, the sky goes dark, you can see the stars for a short time. So they were measuring that from different viewpoints. They saw that star different distances from the sun from where it should have been, because people knew where the star was supposed to be in the sky. But because the sun was in front of it, it bent the light as it went by, and it actually caused the light from behind the sun to come around the side of it, and people could see a star that should have been behind the sun to the side of it. And that was proof that Einstein's theory of relative motion was correct, that there was actually such a thing as space and time, which could literally be bent, and light would travel through it. Though light was traveling in a straight line, to us it appeared to be bent. And that's what relativity is, which is very hard to understand. Trust me, this is the baby steps of it. I never made it to modern cosmology because it's so far beyond that. I mean, it's nothing but calculus. All right, let's see. It's Kepler, who was led to the discovery by observing a similar conjunction, saw that extremely strange star. So it is possible that because of gravitational lensing, as these planets actually lined up, there could be light coming from somewhere that got warped around one, caught around the other one, and got focused into a beam that would have appeared very bright, because where light, it's like this, when light travels, it disperses. It's called, I think the formula is 1 over the radius cubed. So as things are going out, they steadily get dimmer because they're actually dispersing outward. Even though it appears to travel in a straight line, it's actually steadily losing energy and dispersing. So you use a telescope to catch dispersed light and focus it into a single point so that you can view it all kind of put back together so it's nice and bright. So you can actually use gravitational lensing of planets to create a kind of telescope in the sky, which we do with galaxies and stuff currently, to actually get better pictures of stuff. We aim telescopes, like the space telescope gets aimed at, and they'll catch like 2 galaxies, and they'll use because they'll bend the space around them, and they'll actually try to catch a picture between the 2 of them to see things that are behind them. It's all cool. At least in my opinion, it's all cool. But at the time, he's saying that a strange star was observable that shouldn't have been there. Also noticed that when these 3 planets came to conjunction, a new extremely bright evanescent star became visible between Jupiter and Saturn. And he suggested that a similar star had appeared under the same circumstances in the conjunction at the nativity. Of this, of course, there is not any and cannot be an absolute certainty. But if so, this would be the star of the Magi in its rising. There is yet another remarkable statement, which, however, must also be assigned only to the domain of the probable. In the astronomical tables of the Chinese, to whose great trustworthiness so high an authority is as Humboldt bears testimony. And of course, I just thought it could have also been a supernova, because when supernova happen, they're short-lived. I mean, they don't last long, but they're bright when they happen, depending on how big the explosion, how far away the star is. I mean, you can see where there had been nothing in the sky before, suddenly there's a bright star. Some of them so bright that they're as bright as the moon. And in Chinese astronomical calendars, they did record a supernova that was bright like the moon was bright. The appearance of an evanescent star was noted. Pingré and others have designated it as a comet, and collected its first appearance in February 750, which is just the time when the Magi would, in all probability, leave Jerusalem, since this must have preceded the death of Herod, which took place in March 750. And you've got to remember, this book is written 30 years before Einstein. This book is written when archaeology is if it is even there. This is probably before they'd even decided that dinosaurs existed. This is probably written when they were still saying that dinosaurs were dragons. If they found big bones, they were just big giant bones of giants or whatever. The point is that he doesn't know. There's not a lot of information about astronomy except what was observed. We didn't have telescopes at that time high powered enough to create high resolution images. We didn't have CC charge coupled devices. The camera that I'm talking to you on right now is what's called a charged coupled device. It creates a digital image by collecting individual photons of light and reacting to them as they hit it. That's a high powered, age of computers only technology. That's the kind of stuff that we use that stuff was invented for the purpose of looking at stars by astronomers, 50 years ago or 40 years. It's been a while. It's probably 50 years ago now. I was in college 20 years ago, and it's probably 30 years before that at the time. But that's where that technology comes from. It's designed for looking at stars because they create such little bits of light. So guys back then, even though they had big telescopes, they couldn't, the only thing you could collect the light with was your eye or a photographic plate, when they started being able to figure out how to use photographic plates. And the photographic plates were only as good as the length of the exposure that you could make. It's needless to say, he's guessing because they don't have much to work with. Which is just the time when the Magi would, in all probability, have left Jerusalem for Bethlehem, since this must have preceded the death of Herod, which took place on March 750. Moreover, it has been astronomically attained that such a sidereal apparition would be visible to those who had left Jerusalem, and that it would almost seem to go before in the direction of and stand over Bethlehem. Such impartiality stated are the facts of the case, and here the subject must, in the present state of our information, be left. Only two things are recorded to this visit of the Magi to Bethlehem: their humblest Eastern homage and their offerings. Viewed as gifts, the incense and the myrrh would indeed have been strangely inappropriate, but their offerings were evidently intended as specimens of the products of their country, and their presentation was, even as in our own days, excessive of the homage of their country to a newfound king. In this sense, then, the Magi may truly be regarded as the representatives of the Gentile world. Their homage is the first and typical acknowledgement of Christ by those who hitherto had been far off, and their offerings as symbolic of the world's tribute. This deeper significance the ancient church has rightly apprehended, though perhaps mistaking its grounds, its symbolism twining like the convolvulus around the divine plant, has traced in the gold the emblem of his royalty, in the myrrh of his humanity, and that in its fullest evidence of it in his burying, and in the incense that of his divinity. So he's saying that these three gifts were probably meant to refer to certain things that were about him. I mean, like the myrrh is the kind of thing, it's made from a dead plant. I think you have to take dead, how do you make it? I think they take and cut the limbs off of the tree, and then they like dry them out and make them real dead, and then you extract the resin from it, and that's how you made myrrh. I think that's how you do it. It has to do with death, and I think it was used in preparing bodies for death. As always in the history of Christ, so here also glory and suffering appear in juxtaposition. Well, no surprise, because glory, let's say, perfection comes through the cross, not because of the cross. Okay, let me try to make that make sense. Okay, so we are perfected by taking up our cross and dying daily. That you have to do something. That's why he said, do you want to be in the kingdom? Then take up your cross and die daily. Walk upright as I have walked upright. That's the idea. Don't just say, oh, thank you for taking care of my business for me. Now I'm going to go out and do what I want to do. No, obviously not. If you want to be in the kingdom, you're going to have to take up your cross and die daily. And that will allow you to become perfect as you suffer the narrowing, the trials and tribulations, right? That word means to be narrowed. So tribulation is to be narrowed. So if you were walking on a path, the Torah is a path. So you're walking on a path, and that path is steadily getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer and slimmer until you can just barely, you cannot go left or right. You have to walk precisely along that razor's edge, which is the path. And that's all that it's ever been about. You have to learn how to walk the path, or walk the way is another way you might say it. All right. In his divinity, as always, it is the juxtaposition of glory and suffering. It could not be that these magi should become the innocent instruments of Herod's murderous designs, nor yet that the infant Savior should fall victim to the tyrant. Warned of God in a dream, the wise men returned into their country another way, and warned by the angel of the Lord in a dream, the Holy Family sought temporary shelter in Egypt. Baffled in the hope of attaining his object through the Magi, the reckless tyrant sought to secure it by an indiscriminate slaughter of all children in Bethlehem and its immediate neighborhood, from 2 years and under. True, considering the population of Bethlehem, their number could only have been small, probably 20 at most. Really? But the deed was none the less atrocious, and these infants may justly be regarded as proto-martyrs, the first witness. So he's saying that actually, that probably considering how small Bethlehem was, there's probably actually only 20 kids in the whole city that reached that age. That don't mean they should have been killed. The blossom of martyrdom. The slaughter was entirely in accordance with the character and former measures of Herod. Nor do we wonder that it remained unrecorded by Josephus, since on other occasions also he has omitted events which to us seem important. The murder of a few infants in an insignificant village may appear scarcely worth notice in the reign stained by so much bloodshed. Besides, he had perhaps a special motive for this silence. Josephus always carefully suppresses, so far as possible, all that refers to the Christ, probably not only in accordance with his own religious views, but because mention of the Christ might have been dangerous. Certainly it would have been inconvenient in a work written by an intense self-seeker, mainly for readers in Rome. Okay, because remember, he was his story. Supposedly, Josephus was the last survivor of Masada. He was the one who killed everyone else, and he was the last guy left alive, and they captured him at Masada, and then he became historian for Rome. He wrote the Jewish Wars and stuff. And there is a controversy that, some monk put in his writings somewhere that he mentioned that Yeshu had been crucified, who was the Messiah. And, the people say, well, that's fake. Josephus never said that. But, he does point out that Herod did destroy all of the birth records that were in the temple, which would have been tantamount to killing an entire generation of children. because he cut the proof of their ancestral lineage, which was extremely important to Jews, because it told you how, or I don't want to say how important you are, but what your place in the world was based upon the descendants from your ancestors. So you could not be a priest if you're not from the family of Aaron. Now, if you're a Levite, you're born into servitude to the family of Aaron. If you're the firstborn of Israel, then you must be redeemed, because you're not being taken. If you're not redeemed, then you go into slavery to the family of Aaron, because you still have a purpose to fulfill. So you must be redeemed from that purpose. Let's see. Of the two passages in the Old Testament scriptures, the evangelist sees a fulfillment in these events. The flight into Egypt is to him the fulfillment of the expression of Hosea, "Out of Egypt I have called my son," Hosea 11:1. In the murder of the innocents, he sees the fulfillment of Rachel's lament, that is in Jeremiah 31:15, who died and was buried in Ramah. And there was a bitter wailing at the prospect of parting for hopeless captivity, and yet bitter lament, as they who might have encumbered the onward march were piteously slaughtered. Those who have attentively followed the course of Jewish thinking and marked how the ancient synagogue, and that rightly read the Old Testament in its unity, and as ever pointed to the Messiah as the fulfillment of Israel's history, will not wonder at, but fully accord with St. Matthew's retrospective view. The words of Hosea were at the highest sense fulfilled in the flight to and return from by the Savior from Egypt. You have to remember, the temple of Leontopolis was built in the city of Heliopolis, which is what we call today Cairo. It's right down, literally right down the road, like a mile or two away from the Great Pyramids. The Great Pyramids are pointing back towards that city. That's where they had built the temple to Jehovah that was built by Jason Oniad, who had left. He left Israel when Antiochus Epiphanes overthrew his priesthood and established a non-Aaronic priest as high priest. At that point, he said, and left and went down to Egypt, set up a whole new temple, set up the whole sacrificial system. Some say the Ark of the Covenant had been delivered down into Egypt. Some say it went down into Ethiopia. The Catholic Church says it's in Ethiopia today, still in an Ethiopian church waiting, even though you cannot see it unless God wants you to. So basically, there's a room that's empty, and they say it's sitting in that room, but you can't see it until God reveals it. Whatever. Point being, he started a whole new temple. That's the temple that the Alexandrian Jews went to do their sacrifices, which was in Heliopolis. To an inspired writer, nay, to a true Jewish reader of the Old Testament, the question in regard to any prophecy could not be, what did the prophet, but what did the prophecy mean? And this could only be unfolded in the course of Israel's history. Similarly, those who ever saw in the past the prototype of the future and recognized in events not only the principle, but the very features of that which was to come, could not fail to perceive in the bitter wail of the mothers of Bethlehem over their slaughtered children the full realization of the prophetic description of the scene enacted in Jeremiah's days. Had not the prophet himself heard in the lament of the captives to Babylon the echoes of Rachel's voice in the past? In neither one nor the other case had the utterances of the prophets of Hosea and Jeremiah been predictions. They were prophetic. In neither one nor the other case was the fulfillment literal. It was scriptural, and that in the truest Old Testament sense. So there's a law in the Torah that says basically if a prophet comes and tells you something and it doesn't come to pass, don't fear that prophet. I didn't send him. And of course, a prophet that's not sent by God who claims to be a prophet is somebody you're supposed to kill. So if a prophet came to town and said, well, this is going to happen, get ready, and it didn't come to fulfillment, they should be killed. When Jeremiah is prophesying that Babylon's coming and we need to surrender to him because God sent them and you just need to do what they say, Hananias, who is another prophet, right? He's a prophet. He's a for-profit prophet, right? He says, no. Jeremiah walks in with a yoke of an ox on him, and he says, we're going to be yoked, to and servitude and slavery to Nebuchadnezzar. If we don't straighten up, we got to do what God wants. We got to give up, set these slaves free every 7 years like we're supposed to, do what he said, so he'll keep us safe from what's coming, or he's going to send Nebuchadnezzar to correct us, and the correction we receive will be slavery, And Hananias goes and breaks the yoke off him and says, no, we're the head and never the tail. And no, we are the children of God, blah, 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 blah. And they throw Jeremiah down down into the well, or some say down in the sewer, just in the muck, however you want to call it. And Hananias is sitting there at the king's right hand. Of course, then, Nebuchadnezzar comes, and we all know what happened. And eventually he took them all into captivity. There were multiple prophets, but only one of them was telling the true story. Only one of them actually spoke from God. How could anybody have known? At the time of Isaiah, King Manasseh, who was definitely a bad guy. King Manasseh was the son of Hezekiah. He was born during the time when Hezekiah begged God for, he said, Isaiah comes to Hezekiah and tells him, you're going to die. Get your things in order. Hezekiah doesn't have a son. He's like, oh, I don't have a son, I'm going to die. Oh, haven't I done what you wanted? Basically implying to God, don't I deserve more? So he gets more time, right? During that time, he sires Manasseh, who is the most evil king to ever reign. And he does everything he can to destroy the Torah. He tries to destroy all the written documents, everything regarding God. He makes all-out war on the Most High God, and has Isaiah sawn in half, like has him literally sawed in half, put him in a tree and cut the tree in half with him inside of it, right? So he killed him justly, because since everything that Isaiah had said, because he's got what, 60 chapters of prophecy, since all of it had not been fulfilled. Hey, he's a false prophet, right? King says so, killed him. Later, of course, when he gets, imprisoned, when he has his come to God moment, he realizes he was wrong. He done the wrong thing, and he repents, and in the great mercy that is our Creator, he was forgiven. He was forgiven. He had Isaiah sawed in half while he was alive, and God forgave him. And that's the God that's watching you. And that's the God who's looking at you when you're telling yourself all these things you do are so bad, and that you're unsavable, you're unsalvageable. I don't care what you think. You're wrong. There's nothing he can't fix. You definitely aren't powerful enough that he can't fix you. There's nothing that you could do to overpower him. All you got to do is ask for help, and you'll get help. So be blessed in Yeshua's name. Baruch haba Hashem, Baruch haba Yehovah. Blessed be the name of Yehovah. And you know what? Be glad when you see the feet coming of the people that cry out on his name. Thank you for joining me on this reading of the Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah by Alfred Edersheim, which I know is very wordy and can be hard to read. Thanks again. Bye.